Stop.
Not this, just these?
Yeah, just those two start. And then
Brave massages. Just kidding.
Okay, that's the health nurse side.
That's it. Everybody needs a massage once a week and we'd all feel better. Messages and Brave. Well, I would say that I guess both are double-sided. I would say that there are brave people working very I don't want to use the word hard, working very strategically or in a very focused manner in very many parts of our community, and taking initiative that takes a brave character. And then on the flip side to that, those that are continuing to take breath every morning in the face of their probable sense of hopelessness. There's that sense of being brave. Messages, what messages are we giving our children about valuing spirit and individuals, and what messages are we giving the rest of the world and future generations about what's important? What messages are we giving each other in the community about who's important and why they're important? And then 10% of all new units be dedicated to affordable housing is required in the City of Langford, with proceeds to be remitted to the City of Victoria Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and units to be administered by CRD Housing or not-for-profit agencies. You'd be surprised, I ran, part of my campaign for election was 5% of all new units be dedicated to affordable housing. And I've gone back to that several times in the last year and thought, how can it be so bureaucratic that that's so difficult to implement? But it actually, any time you're going to tax someone, in essence, there's a lot that you're up against. It's not as simple as saying 5%. So it is definitely something that's being discussed, and definitely something that has been proposed, and something that I would suggest be part of it, an inventory and categorized in terms of it, looking at where we get the most bang for our buck. Do we put our energy into ensuring that 10% of all new units is dedicated to affordable housing? Or if there's only so much energy, do we focus it elsewhere? So I think that is definitely it's a viable option, and it's got precedent, and I'm not entirely sure of how Langford has written their policy or their bylaws around it, but it's certainly something that's exploring and consideration. Thanks, Anna.
I'm just reflecting on Jeremy Harris saying that 10% is way too low. If you do it, if that's as much as you do, you might as well not do it. When he talked about below market housing, when I broach the possibility with developers, it's kind of like the what's in it for me is the first question they ask, and they want all kinds of forgiveness of all kinds of other things to do even a small amount. So it's like a punitive, hostile kind of conversation as opposed to something that's collaborative and positive.
Yeah, and I don't get what's in it for me. I get, fine, we'll pass it on to the buyers then. And then I don't see how that ends up helping in the long run, because then market housing just increases and the gap gets bigger, and it doesn't, unless it's somehow worked into the formula there's something called a pro forma, which outlines, which I'm just learning about, which in Vancouver, every single development is required to submit a pro forma with their development application, and that pro forma outlines, what the cost of land was, cost of development, expected income, not income, what's the word, expected earnings or revenue. And in that case, you could potentially, if we had a requirement to see pro formas with all developments, then it would be easier to plug in that 10% into the appropriate byline instead of it just being then tagged onto the development in general and then that's passed on to the buyer.
So even like if you're having, there's a growing gap, and if you're passing on 10% to the buyer, wouldn't it still help though to be able to take some of that?
I think it's a difficult question because there's the rich and then the poor and then there's the in-between. And I think that in-between, if they're not supported, they'll be in poverty. So the working poor and the sort of middle lower class, they can't, those are the ones that are now falling between the cracks and adding to the numbers. So if housing prices continue to rise, it'd be different if you said that all 10% of all units over $780,000, those folks potentially would be in a better position to be able to afford it.
What about, it's just, I'll keep coming back to the privatization of the hydro, and it just seems that the money that's coming out of communities where you have a power plant go in and supposedly it's 3%. It goes back to the actual province, but let's say and you're talking numbers 50 million, 100 million a year. What happens if 10 or 20% of that went into a homelessness fund or a community fund just for community projects? Because it just seems that the money that's coming out of the resources near the communities doesn't go back into the communities.
But see, that to me takes it down to a really project by project, individual, sort of individual circumstance by individual circumstance. And if you look at those and you say, well, why aren't we in the Bay building? Why aren't people living there? It's like, duh, yeah, why aren't they? It makes sense. But when you pull it up to that higher level where we were a minute ago, to the who does it benefit and is it solvable, and that's the answer to the question, is because it can't work that way. That's not the way the system works.